All right, welcome back. So in this video, we're going to take a look at how Vladimir Propp specifically did this process here. So first off, who is or who was Vladimir Propp? There's a lot to get into here, but let's start with that. So Vladimir Propp was a scholar of folklore and fairy tales. He analyzed the Russian equivalent of fairy tales, which are called sort of wonder tales, Kazka, and analyzed sort of the structure of them. He basically felt that if you could find the different kinds of events that would appear in a fairy tale, you could see how these basically made up the structure of a fairy tale. And he argued that all fairy tales can be described in terms of 31 different kinds of plot events. And he called these plot events, he called them functions. Now, the important thing to remember is you're not trying to go for 100% of the functions in a fairy tale. So every fairy tale will usually only have some of them. It would be sort of rare for a fairy tale to have every single one. Instead, this is sort of trying to describe all the fairy tales at once. So these are all the different flavors. You know, you could have ice cream with 3 different flavors, but then you can do that in so many different ways if there's 31 flavors at Baskin Robbins. It's kind of funny coincidence there, 31. Now what he did is he gave letters of the alphabet to the different functions. And I think the reason he did this was because he argued that functions went in roughly the same order. There were functions, plot events that happened at the beginning of a story, and there were plot events that happened at the end of a story. And that kind of makes sense, right? There are some things that are more beginning sorts of ideas, and there are some things that are really ending sorts of ideas. Now, there is some freedom to mix it up, and we'll see if the alphabet soup actually works for him or not. But you can mix it around. You can do quite a lot with the order. It doesn't have to be super strictly alphabetical, but there's some room to play around there. But there are sort of beginning and ends in a sense of, it kind of flows in a certain way. But that's all very abstract. So let's go ahead and let's get into it more specifically. Like I said, you can kind of talk about a cast of characters as well as a series of events. And Propp called his cast of characters the dramatis personae. I don't know if you have ever seen that word before, but if you've gone to a play and you were looking at the program, you might have seen the phrase dramatis personae. It means the sort of list of characters in a play. It's Latin. It literally means people of the drama. So this is kind of our cast of characters for a fairy tale. Propp, says identify those first and then describe what happened to them. So that's one of his terms there. Function is his term for an event that happens, basically a building block of the fairy tale, building block of the story. And he called it that because he argued that every story event performs a function. They do something for the fairy tale. They're trying to achieve some sort of effect or create the structure of the story. And so he called, his last term I want to mention is morphology. He called this the study of the shape of the fairy tale. Morph means shape. So that's what he was trying to do here. So I'm going to open up and take a look at the resources we have here. So let's look first at the sort of big handout that explains all the details here. So this is the one that really is sort of going to give you all the information here, including the dramatis personae, the cast of characters. So once it loads here, we'll be able to take a look at that in more depth here. Okay, so here we can see Propp's list of the dramatis personae, the cast of characters, and each character, each figure has functions that are usually strongly associated with them. Then after that, we get into all of the different letters and what they represent. But let's start with the cast of characters here. So in pretty much every story, we have a hero. It's pretty hard to escape the role of the hero. And the hero usually is trying to solve a problem. A problem that Propp calls either a harm or a lack. Something is trying to be found, or some wrong that has been done to the hero is trying to be dealt with. And the hero has various things that they do along the way. But ultimately, the hero kind of goes on a process from A to W. The W is the wedding at the end of the story. Now, not every story has to end in a literal wedding, but usually the wedding is something that is like the characters happily ever after. This is a common thing in fairy tales, right? It all ends happily ever after. That's what the hero is trying to do. So the hero leaves their home. That's represented by an arrow. The hero encounters other characters, and the hero ultimately ends in a wedding. They may defeat the villain along the way, but ultimately that's kind of the core journey. The journey is theirs to undergo. Now, the hero doesn't always have to be a handsome prince. The hero can, in fact, be a female, in which case we would have, we would flip some things around here and have a female heroine or hero. A good example of this is Cinderella. It's her story, and she's reacting to a handsome prince. But ultimately, you know, she fits the hero role. Then you have the villain. This is usually the one, if the hero has been harmed, if the hero has a problem at the beginning of the story, this is usually the one who caused the problem. Not every story has a villain causing the problem, but when there is a villain, they are always going to cause a problem for the hero. They may struggle, they may conflict with the hero, and they may chase the hero. Ultimately, they will meet with punishment. Sorry, there's a couple of typos here, but ultimately the villain is usually punished. Then you have other types of characters as well. A big one is the princess. So in the male hero story, the princess is female and is sort of the reward for the end of the quest. You know, at the end of the story, the prince marries the princess. And so the princess is very closely connected to the wedding. But often there are other things involved, like a difficult task that the princess makes the hero undergo. We saw this with the Raven girl. She gave him these difficult tasks, which he kept failing. So he was ultimately the hero, even though the story was named after her. But in the story of Cinderella, this would actually be a prince instead of a princess. So hero and princess versus heroine and prince. Some other types of characters we see. There are a lot of helpers and donors, and these are pretty similar. The helper is anyone who helps the hero at a critical moment along the way. So some of the ways they can do this is they can transform the hero, they can transport the hero, they can rescue the hero from being attacked by the villain. They can do a lot of different things like that. Yeah, so they are just generally helpful figures. Donors help in a very specific way. They give the hero a magical gift, or they give the hero advice. Basically, they give the hero some sort of tool, and then they don't appear in the story as much after that in the way that helpers would. So the donor, it's always D for donor. But we'll talk about that more specifically. The hero gives the donor gives the hero some sort of gift that allows them to succeed in their quest. In the Raven Girl, we saw this with the robbers. And yes, they didn't willingly want to give the hero the gift, but they did. Then you have the giant who gives the hero a map. In Cinderella, this would be the fairy godmother giving the hero, giving Cinderella magical clothes. A couple more are worth mentioning. They don't appear as often, but they're notable. Sometimes you just have a character whose entire function is to send the hero on their way. And so this character is known as the dispatcher. They dispatch the hero on their journey. So in some stories, this is just like a king who sends you on a quest or something like that. You could argue maybe in the Raven Girl that this is the original queen who sent the Raven Girl out into the forest. But in another sense, yeah, it's kind of tricky to fit into some stories. But just anybody who kind of sends the hero on their way fits into category B, or into the category of the dispatcher. And finally, the last character I want to mention is the false hero. So the false hero is someone who tries to be the hero or pretends to be the hero and ends up kind of interfering with the hero or just failing at the task that the hero succeeds at. These would maybe be Cinderella's stepsisters in the story of Cinderella. They appear to be heroic, but they are actually not. And one of the big tropes or functions for the false hero is making big claims to be the hero. And another is being revealed as a false hero and kind of exposed. So those are kind of our core categories here. Let's look at the functions themselves. So let's go back here. So yep, here's the recap of the different cast of characters here. And sometimes the princess is connected to a father figure who is testing the hero, you know, are you prepared to marry my daughter? But sometimes she just tests the hero on her own. But they're kind of basically the same thing on a functional level. Okay, so this is how you do it. If you were going to analyze a fairy tale according to Vladimir Propp, this is how you would go about it. Step number one, read the fairy tale without any sort of preconceptions, because you want to appreciate it on its own level before you do any of this analytical stuff and just get a sense of it before you dive into this. Number two is to come up with your cast of characters. So identify which different characters fit which different archetypes here. So kind of like we were doing for Cinderella. Then number three is identify the most important function, which is the harm or the lack. And for Propp, this is A. So he gives it letter A because this is kind of, in his mind, the start of the story. A harm, he always writes with a capital A. So harm is specifically when the hero is harmed by the villain. If the villain's not involved, it's usually not thought of as a harm. When the villain is involved, then it's a harm. But if there's no villain, then it's a lack. The hero lacks something or wants something. In either case, this is going to be what sends the hero out on their journey to go off and to encounter the world. So this is basically the motivating factor for the story. So that's step number three, is to identify the harm or the lack. So you could write big A or little a next to it, depending on what you found there. And what is the problem that's being solved? The next part is, the next thing you do actually is work on the prologue, because Propp has noticed that there are a lot of functions that really only apply to the prologue of the story. He calls this the preparatory part, or I like to call it the prologue. And the prologue is kind of everything that leads up to the harm or the lack. And again, a lot of these stages are optional. You don't have to have every single letter. But for these prologue things, Propp uses a Greek letter. But if you just want to write alpha, beta, gamma, stuff like that, and not write the actual Greek letter, that's fine too. So these are the things that sort of lead up to the harm that the villain causes to the hero and involve things like trickery or commandments or obedience or disobedience. But I'm going to explain this in a little more detail in a second here. Finally, once you're all done with the preparatory part, then you can start actually doing letters of the alphabet. So these include such things as a difficult task and a wedding, the hero's return, the villain pursuing the hero, the donor giving a magical gift to the hero, and all sorts of other things like that. So the idea is, if you can make a list of all these different letters that appear in a particular story, then you will really understand that story. You'll understand its structure. You'll understand how it works. So this is all very abstract and probably pretty confusing. So let's go through it with an actual example. One example that I have found to be really handy for our analysis here, because it fits the structure of fairy tales so well, is the movie Shrek. Shrek is, based on fairy tales, right? So let's go ahead and analyze Shrek according to this structure. So what's our step number one? Step number one is to have watched the movie Shrek. Okay, may not be true for all of us, but it's probably true for a lot of us in here. And in any case, I'll walk you through all the high points here. You know, you will really feel like you've watched the movie Shrek after this. Okay, so let's do our analysis of Shrek according to the way Vladimir Propp would analyze it as a fairy tale. Okay, so number one was we watched the movie Shrek. Number two is the dramatis personae. Okay, so who is our cast of characters for Shrek, and what roles do they represent? Okay, well, first off, we've got a hero. Who is our hero? Well, it's got to be Shrek. He is the ogre, so it's turning the fairy tale inside out, but he is the protagonist of the story, and he makes the most sense on the hero. He's the one who goes on a quest. That's how you know he's the hero. Okay, who's our villain? Probably Lord Farquaad. He is the one who causes a problem for Shrek. And we're going to get into what that problem is in a second, but he fits that role really well. And he is ultimately the one who's defeated at the end of the story. Okay, do we have a dispatcher? Maybe Lord Farquaad as well. He is the one who sends Shrek on a quest, even though he ultimately ends up being the villain. It's up for debate whether the villain and the dispatcher can be the same person, but I'd say they can. You can have characters sort of occupying multiple roles. We have a princess. This one's very clear. It's Princess Fiona. She really fits that role very well. You know, don't get me wrong, she's her own character here, but in terms of the function of the story, she ends up being part of Shrek's happily ever after. So she fits that princess role perfectly. Then we have donors and helpers, who are often very similar. But do we have a character who gives Shrek a gift? Or do we have a character who helps Shrek? I would say both of these, donkey could work. My initial instinct is to make him a helper, because most of what he does things like transport Shrek with the help of the dragon, and that's a very helper thing to do, is transport. He also sort of motivates Shrek and helps him at various points along his journey. That's a very helper thing to do. But you can also see the donor as someone who gives a gift of advice that helps the hero deal with a problem or a puzzle. And so if we think about it in that way, a donkey might maybe work as the donor, as a donor figure as well. Let's see. Finally, do we have any false heroes? False hero? I would say Lord Farquaad again. He tries to present himself as a hero. He tries to present himself as that classic knight in shining armor. And this is something we see even more in Shrek 2, is sort of the knight in shining armor versus Shrek. But Lord Farquaad is playing this role of the false hero. And ultimately, he is exposed and unmasked. So he works as the villain in a particularly false hero type of way. Okay, so that's our cast of characters. Now let's get into what they do. So number 3 in our analysis is a harm or a lack. Which do you think it is? Is it a harm or is it a lack? Well, since there's a villain involved in causing Shrek's problems, it is a harm. So this is a harm from the villain. And the harm is, what are you doing in my swamp? Can't do a Scottish accent, so I won't even try. This is specifically the fact that Lord Farquaad banished all the fairy tale creatures from his realm, and they all took up residence in Shrek's swamp. So Shrek is forced to deal with this problem. That is a textbook example of a harm that has been done to him by the villain. Okay, but there's a lot more we can go into when we do the preparatory part. Or if you just want to call it a prologue, that's fine too. The preparatory part is basically the story of how those fairy tale creatures got to be in Shrek's swamp. And really just sort of anything that fits into a sort of prologue-y setup type of framework. So let's go back and take a look at the document here. So the preparatory part, the different steps we can do here. We don't have to have every step, but we can look and see if any of these are involved. So Propp's very first entry on his list, he says, is technically not a function. This is the initial situation. And so the initial situation would be something like, Shrek is an ogre who lives in a swamp. That would be the very beginning of the story before anything, even prologue things happen. If we switch back to, sorry, we're going to be jumping back and forth a lot here. So alpha is Shrek lives in a swamp. Then we have beta, which is, Propp calls this absentation, which basically means the character is isolated in some way. Either a family member has died or the character has left home and has become isolated. So for Shrek, how is he isolated? Well, you could basically say the above. He is lonely. He is an outcast. So that fits very well with the idea of absentation. He's alone in his swamp. Okay, gamma, if we want to switch back again here, gamma is a commandment not to do something. And delta is the disobedience of that commandment. I don't know that we really have a clear example of that in the prologue of Shrek. Maybe just don't go into Shrek's swamp, and that is disobeyed. More frequently, it's the hero who does the disobedience of the commandment. But Propp calls this an interdiction. So he uses two letters for this. Gamma is the interdiction, is the commandment not to do something, the interdiction, and then delta is the disobedience of the interdiction. I don't think we have a clear example of that with Shrek, but that's fine. Then we have the opportunity for the villain to perform reconnaissance, or basically spying is another way to think of it. The villain spies on the hero or spies on somebody in some way. I think arguably we have that with Lord Farquaad. He spies on the princesses using his magic mirror, or basically he asks, who would be a good princess for me to marry? And so he goes for Princess Fiona. And this is something we see in Snow White as well, with, spying on Snow White, saying, who's the fairest one of all? And again, this is two letters here because zeta is the villain finding out the answer. Let's go back to our list here, jump back again. So epsilon is, who should I marry? And then zeta is Princess Fiona. So that's our spying and answer step there. Okay, so going back once again, the other thing that the villain can do in the prologue of the story is trickery. The villain tries to trick someone to get them to do what they want. Maybe you could say that Shrek is kind of tricked into going on this journey because ultimately he just wants to have his swamp back. Or you could say that that Lord Farquaad is sort of tricking Fiona by sending Shrek on this quest instead of himself. But these would be letters eta and theta. So let's see. So theta would be agreement to being tricked. Now, I do see sometimes these letters can kind of jump around the story a little bit, particularly the one about commandments that you're not supposed to disobey. Those happen at various points in stories too. I don't know how Propp would deal with them, but I feel like it's fine if you want to move them to after the prologue, if you really think it fits. But most of the time, these things appear in the prologue. So if we kind of redo our process here, all of this is ultimately leading up to what are you doing in my swamp? I guess another way to think of it is you could say tricks the fairy tale creatures into going into Shrek's swamp. Yeah, maybe that's stronger because it comes in the prologue. As you can see, there's some room for interpretation here. And it really depends on where you want to say the actual start of the plot is. But now we've made it up to the harm. So now we can go back and look at the later functions. So these are the ones that have more to do with the letters of the alphabet. And honestly, so I know it's a lot to remember all of these. Mostly what I'm looking for is for you to remember the most important ones. I have some of the most important ones listed here. And let's just focus on these. You can look at the worksheets, the handouts, if you want to look at all the different functions. But here are some of the ones that are the most important. And then as long as you can kind of draw on some of these types of events and see them, identify them within fairy tales, that's what I'm looking for. So let's take a look at how these would apply to Shrek. Let's look at B, C, and D. So B is for a dispatcher. The dispatcher sends the hero away from home. C is for a counteraction. And Propp is being very cute and trying to make it fit there by using the letter C. Counteraction is the hero deciding to take action. The hero deciding to solve their problem. And then D is for the donor. So the D is the appearance of the donor to give the hero a magical aid. And there's a whole donor sequence based on the letters D, E, F. D is the appearance of the donor. E is the donor testing the hero in some way, or the hero having to fight the donor. And then F is the donor giving their gift. So let's see how these would apply in Shrek. So let's start with the dispatcher. So, or the dispatch away from home is Lord Farquaad sends Shrek away on his quest. So that fits perfectly. Then we have an up arrow is usually when the hero leaves home. But we also have a counteraction. So I'll just put Shrek leaves home. But we also have the counteraction, which is Shrek decides to get the fairy tales, the creatures away, or to get rid of them. And arguably that happens before the dispatching in this story, so it's a little bit out of order, but that's fine. They can be flexible like that. So we've got Shrek deciding to get rid of the fairy tale creatures. We've got Lord Farquaad sending them away, and Shrek leaving home. Then we've got our donor. And if we want to say Donkey's the donor, D for Donkey the donor, he meets Donkey. That's letter D. And over the course of the story, Donkey certainly tests him a whole lot. He tests his patience more specifically. But it's sort of, Donkey is sort of, helping him ultimately. And so this is good. Donkey tests Shrek. And then finally, F, Shrek gets a gift from Shrek. And we kind of said that the gift was advice, right? Donkey gives him good guidance, and that would be sort of the gift that Shrek gets from him. And I would say the advice comes in the form of, you need friends. He helps Shrek to realize that, he can't spend all this time alone. And, ultimately he shouldn't abandon friendship and be bitter and jaded. So that's ultimately helpful to Shrek because it allows him to be brave enough to go and rescue Fiona from Farquaad. But let's go back to the list here of the important ones. let's see. Oh my gosh, have we been on there that whole time? Sorry, guys. Here's my list. If you want to take a look real quick, here's the list that I've been working on so far. So now we can go back to the functions here. So I think one of the most important functions is letter K. So K stands for, well, it doesn't really stand for anything. These letters are kind of falling apart as abbreviations, but K is when the hero solves the original problem. So this is when the hero solves the original harm or the lack. And it's interesting that in a lot of fairy tales, this is not the end of the story. In fact, usually it's not the end of the story. Because the hero ultimately ends up doing something different than they were originally setting out to do. This is sort of, the hero thinks that they're doing one thing, but their ultimate victory is the wedding. So there's a process that is very frequent of like A to K to W. Harm or lack to like dealing with that original problem, but the hero has become involved with something else and achieves an even greater victory than they did over their original problem. They haven't just solved their problem, they've ended up married to a princess. So we can definitely see these in Shrek's story. So if we look at letter K, what does Shrek solving his original problem look like? So K, what was Shrek's original problem? He's got all these fairy tale creatures in his swamp. He solves that problem. He gets the fairy tale creatures out. And, that's very helpful for him, except that he's ultimately really bitter and jaded about it. And he yells at Donkey and tells him to get out. And he's like, I'm being alone forever. And that is because he has lost the affection of Fiona. And so he's realized, on some level anyway, that getting these fairy tale creatures out of his swamp isn't ultimately making him happy because he still has something else that he wants to do. And so ultimately this is going to lead to W, the wedding. And what happens at the wedding? Well, Shrek actually rescues Fiona from Lord Farquaad, from having to marry Lord Farquaad, and that wedding, but then he manages to go and have his own wedding with Fiona. So it's really, two weddings that appear in the story, but they all serve the function of a greater victory, which is marrying Fiona himself and, pursuing Fiona and having that happily ever after. But if we look at some stuff that happens before then, what else have we got in this story here? Some of the more common ones are the hero has a difficult task and the hero overcomes this difficult task. That's letters M and N. So arguably we see this in the story. So M and N are the difficult task. So a difficult task might be, getting through the castle would be a difficult task. And then difficult task would be, N would be success. So that could arguably be a task set by Fiona effectively that Shrek has to overcome. Oh, sorry, I accidentally paused the screen sharing here. Let's go back here. Here we go. So yes, getting through the castle and then success. And now let's swap back again. What else have we got? The hero returns. It's interesting because Propp gives this a letter and he also gives it a down arrow. You also have stories where the villain pursues the hero and the hero is rescued from the villain. Arguably, we don't see that in Shrek. We do see the return of the hero, though, and we do see the punishment of the villain. So let's go ahead and put those on here. So return, Shrek goes back. And we can also put a down arrow, which I'm going to put a V there. Or actually, I'll do this. It's not perfect, but that's a down arrow. Shrek goes back home. He returns home. That's something we see in a lot of these stories. And then U is the punishment of the villain. And this is this is how is Lord Farquaad punished? He is eaten by the dragon. Shrek is a very well written story. Everything kind of ties together. You have the dragon, and then the dragon comes and it acts as the villain's punishment. It's pretty clever. This is, the punishment of the villain. Very, very perfectly fits into there. Other things. We said that Lord Farquaad was a false hero. So letter L is what Propp uses for false hero, making false claims. Basically, Lord Farquaad's false claims are basically claiming to be the real noble figure that Fiona should marry. And eventually his false claims are exposed. And for this, Propp gives the letters EX. So he doesn't give it an X. So this alphabet stuff is starting to fall apart. I don't know why his system is the way it is, but exposure of the villain. Basically, Lord Farquaad is revealed to be a jerk at the wedding. So all this kind of happens at the same time, and that's fine. So all of this is the story. And these are kind of the main, I think with Shrek, we see a lot of the main stuff from the list of functions taking place. Now, if we go back here, this handout will give you all the different things here. So this will explain what each of these functions is and give you the quick little name and letter for them. If you can remember the letters, I find it helpful. You don't have to, have every letter memorized necessarily, but just a sense of how they're kind of going in an order and how that all works. There's some other things we could put for Shrek, like travel between two different kingdoms. That's definitely something he does. Being marked in some way, maybe. I don't know if we have that with the helmet or him being an ogre, but there are different sorts of versions of that. In Shrek 1, we don't see transformation, but we do see it in Shrek 2, and that's kind of interesting. So let's go and look at the sort of simpler handout too while we're at it. This cheat sheet here. So this is the sort of shortcut handout here. Smaller one, we're still viewing here. Yes, okay. We'll just watch that unfold here. All right, so this one is very handy, but can be a little misleading, so I wanted to talk about it. This is basically all 31 functions, and just a quick little name for each of them. Now, the important thing to remember is that these functions have very specific functions. So don't be misled by the words that are used for them. For instance, H is struggle. What kind of struggle are we talking about here? H is specifically for any struggle with the villain that doesn't lead to the hero's victory. So H would be, if Lord Farquaad came and confronted Shrek at some point, and then Shrek escaped. That would be the sort of thing we're talking about. Similarly, I is for victory, but specifically a victory over the villain. And this is usually a temporary victory that's linked to the struggle. So if Shrek managed to defeat Lord Farquaad, but not for good, that would be the victory that we're talking about here. K is the resolution of the original problem, but not any kind of resolution. The final resolution is that W, wedding. So these can be a little misleading, so be sure to check the longer page too. But if you just want to have a list of the functions in front of you, this is a pretty great way to do it. Okay, so maybe it looks a little simpler when we just see them laid out like this. There's not as many as there seems to be. The tricky thing is just sort of keeping track of the different the different things in the story that can fit the function and how the cast of characters fit the different functions. So we can see that different functions go along with different characters. The characters can do different things for the hero or as the hero. So this page is maybe useful to see how that pattern works. There was one more thing I wanted to mention is that Propp basically has this idea which he calls sequences or moves. So when you put a group of functions together, it makes a move. So the most common move is from A to K, right? And to W. The hero has a problem, they solve their original problem, and then achieves the greater victory, which is the wedding. So that's like the overall sort of core spine of the story. But there are other moves within the story as well. ABC would be the hero recognizing there's a problem and leaving home to do something about it. DEF would be the donor sequence, the donor move. And interestingly, Propp sometimes sees certain fairy tales as being basically two fairy tales superglued together, or two, moves superglued together, which makes sense, right? When we have parataxis and you can kind of join unrelated things with each other. So Propp identifies, you can have a storyline which works something like A to K, and then A to K, and then to W. So you could have problem number one, solving problem number one, then problem number two, then solving problem number two, and then finally the victory at the end. You could have a story that works like that, where it kind of effectively starts over. So you have two moves there. You could also have a story with two heroes, in which case Propp introduces one more function, which is parting. So the heroes split up and they go on separate legs of the journey at different points. And so he gives that the letter Y, which is very cute because what does Y look like? It looks like a fork in the road branching off, So this is heroes parting in the road. And so from then on, the heroes have their individual quests. They have their own independent weddings, or maybe they solve their problems separately, but they come back together for the wedding. That's the kind of thing you could do if you're putting some of these moves together. But Propp is very adamant that all of these, that once you have these, you basically have all you need to know about fairy tales. This is sort of the structure of them all. And if you have this knowledge of a particular fairy tale, like Shrek, you have the knowledge of what Shrek is and how it works. And he doesn't mind that certain elements are left out of Shrek here. We don't even know necessarily in this that Shrek is an ogre, but that's okay because he says that as a fairy tale, this is how it works on a structural level. So yeah, this may be something you want to think about. What are the advantages and the disadvantages of this type of approach? Something to chew on. We'll be working more with this approach on Thursday. We'll practice with some more examples like the Wizard of Oz. And then finally, we will kind of gather our thoughts and see how well do we think Propp's approach works? Would it work on mythology? For today, I want to leave you guys with a discussion question which is really Propp practice. So let's go ahead and take a look at it here. So if we go back to the content page for today, let's see here. Unfortunately, the internet takes time to load. So don't forget the reading check as well. But the main discussion for today is called Trying Out Propp. So your goal will be to pick a fairy tale. And I have a list of lots of different fairy tales right here, including a few different versions of Cinderella. Some of these are probably familiar. Some of them are less familiar, maybe. The story of the Winged Wolf is probably unfamiliar. That would be a Russian one of the type of like the 100 different fairy tales that Propp was looking at. Or you can pick something more familiar like Hansel and Gretel or Cinderella or Little Red Riding Hood. So your goal will be to go through this process, identify the cast of characters, and find at least 3 functions that are used in the story. And if you want to skip the cast of characters part and just skip straight to the functions, you can. But I always find it's more helpful to know who the different characters are. So basically, you'll find in the story at least 3 functions that are in the story. And your goal will be to explain, to just say, this event fits this function. For instance, if you were doing the Goose Girl, the Goose Girl is not on this list, but if you were doing the Goose Girl instead of one of these, you could say that one function is transformation, letter T. because the goose girl is altered in her clothes into being a goose girl instead of the princess that she actually is. Something like that. So you could, for your answer, you could put T, transformation, and the event is having her clothes stolen. Something like that. For this part, this is mostly just sort of saying what you think, but if you see something that one of your classmates has said and you want to respond to it and think, oh, that's interesting, I did that function differently, that would be just fine. So, just try to be nice. Don't be like, you're wrong, but try to be, nice and just say, oh, I thought it was different. That's interesting. Or even, I agree, that makes sense. For this, you'll probably want to refer back to these two handouts here, which will help you understand, or to the PowerPoint, which has sort of my interpretation of it. Okay, so that's your task for today, is to do this discussion here. And then when we meet on Thursday, we will get some more practice together and go through it together and hopefully make it more understandable. So I will see you guys then. Take care.